know that there are going to be times when you're going to be disappointed by the quality or the tone of the journalism. And it's because it often is being done by folks who have not been here their whole lives and who have not had long reporting careers, because that's not what the outlets can afford to pay for. But I don't think people understand how much would be lost if that went away altogether, because just being on the other side of things in Fairbanks, I participate in meetings and hearings, and I'll be there and there's no reporter present. And I'm like, oh my God, if people knew what was happening.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Tom Hewitt, the former opinions editor of the Anchorage Daily News from 2018 to 2024. He previously was editorial page editor of the Fairbanks Daily News-Miner and news director of KTVF and KXDF in Fairbanks. He is currently special assistant to Fairbanks North Star Borough Mayor Grier Hopkins.
Tom Hewitt, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Where were you born? Where'd you grow up?
I was born and raised in Fairbanks. I was actually born on Fort Wainwright at the old Bassett Army Community Hospital. They've got a new one now, but yeah, I was born on base there. My dad's a former Marine, and grew up on Sheena Hot Springs Road east of Fairbanks, and went to Weller Elementary, Tanana Middle School, and Lathrop High School, where I graduated in 2001, and went on briefly to New Mexico Tech as an astrophysics major. Came back to UAF because I didn't have enough money to continue going to New Mexico Tech. So yeah, went on at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, continued in astrophysics for a while, switched to computer science, and then eventually switched to journalism. And that was where I felt like I'd come home. And that was my ultimate major at UAF, and went right from that into local news reporting in Fairbanks as a TV news reporter.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience as a child in Fairbanks and how it might be different than growing up somewhere else?
I think the biggest thing that's different from then to now is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, which was just my experience in the public school system. And we had great schools then, and we had band and orchestra that started at fourth grade, and I started playing the cello then. And we had just all the AP classes you could shake a stick at Lathrop, and I took most of them. And I look at what's going on now, and it just breaks my heart, because there's families that are moving away, and we no longer have band or orchestra or any kind of music offerings beyond the base level music class in elementary schools in Fairbanks anymore. And I just think about what it would have been like for me to not have had those opportunities. And it's a little tough, but it's not like it was all sunshine and roses. I was born in 83, and so I was entering the school system right around the time that the bottom fell out of the oil market. And so it was a really tough time for Fairbanks and for the state in general. There's a lot of job loss. There's some real economic uncertainty. It felt, I think, probably a little more acutely dire, although I didn't realize it at the time, than our situation does now, where we're looking at oil and we're like, this isn't doing it anymore. But Fairbanks was and is a very special place to be because of the people. And that's, I think, why most of the people who live there like it, despite kind of the variability of the weather and the smoke in the summers from fires and things like that.
Did your dad retire from the Marines?
He did, but he retired abruptly. He went to Vietnam, and he was on patrol in August of 1968. And he was a second lieutenant in charge of a platoon in Da Nang. And there was a grenade attack on his platoon, ambushed in the middle of the night. And so he was hit by the grenade, and they thought he was going to die, but he made a full recovery. And so with 100% disability, was retired from the Marines, and has been living a non-military life since then.
What did he do after the military?
He went back to Alaska. He had already come to Alaska at that point. He's originally from Kansas, and he really, from a very young age, wanted to come to Alaska, and kind of think that, the sort of wide open spaces appealed to him, as he will tell you, so I don't feel uncomfortable sharing this story. He had the dream of being in a place where you could take a piss off your back porch and nobody would be bothered by it. So that was what I think he was chasing. And also, he's always been very big into hunting and fishing. And this offered more opportunities for that than anywhere else.
Having a dad who was hit by a grenade in Vietnam and almost died, did he have PTSD? Did he have any issues? Were you acutely aware of that as a child?
Not really. I mean, like I was aware of it because there's a kind of a spot on the right side of his skull that no longer exists. And so it's a little bit sunken in there because he chose to not have a metal plate put in because he didn't want to set off the metal detector at the airport when he flew. But in terms of how it affected his personality, I don't know that it affected it tremendously. I, of course, don't know what he was like beforehand, so it's hard to say. I think what probably affected him a lot more profoundly, he definitely didn't have the sort of like more classic PTSD symptoms of, fits of anger or fear responses to things like loud noises, none of that. And I don't think he really was affected tremendously in that way. But what did profoundly affect, I think, the rest of his life and the way that he's lived it is that he had a twin brother whose name was also Tom, who I'm named after. And in 1970, Tom was killed in an attack on Firebase Ripcord. He was an Army captain, and he was hit by an RPG within the first few minutes of an attack on his firebase. And that was, I think anybody who's had a twin and lost the twin will testify to that being, it's like losing part of yourself. They weren't identical twins, they were fraternal, but they had grown up together wearing the same clothes and doing the same sports and hunting and fishing together. I think a lot of his adult life has been defined by the loss of his brother. And you can see it in his writing too. He was an outdoor writer and he wrote for 30 plus years for a magazine called Gray's Sporting Journal, hunting and fishing stuff. And a lot of it was about...
Was that what he did as an occupation post-military?
It was a vocation. Like in terms of the money he made, a lot of it, he worked for construction. He ultimately worked at the Eielson power plant. But of course, that's not the kind of, you're dreaming of your career and you're working at a coal power plant on a military base. But I think it was his passion, is his passion. And so, that's what I see him putting the most of himself into, was that. And so in retrospect, I think it made a lot of sense eventually when I went into journalism, like, oh, of course this makes sense, that this is something that I would be into, given that it's very similar to my dad's experience and what he was passionate about.
So your dad was supportive of you going into journalism? He
was, yeah. Like, he has broadly been supportive of me regardless. So I don't think I don't think it would have disappointed him for me to do really anything, although I did tell him when I was a high school senior that I was considering joining the Marines because I was just like weighing all of my options, and I had scored very well on the ASVAB, which I took on a whim because I like taking tests. And he said that he didn't think that the Marines really had jobs that were well suited for people like me, which I choose to see as they wouldn't make use of my particular talents, versus the kind of the negative side of that, which is that my physical aptitude wouldn't be up to par with the average Marine, which I think both of those things are probably true.
What did your mom do?
When we were growing up, she largely didn't have full-time employment. She was a stay-at-home mom because there were 6 of us.
Which number were you?
2.
Number 2 of 6.
Yeah, I have one older sister. She lives in New Zealand now. And then of the rest of them, almost all of us still live in Fairbanks doing different things. But yeah, as you can imagine, raising 6 children mostly by yourself is a full-time job. And she would even do things like take us on summer vacations to Canada to visit her family because she's a Canadian citizen and most of her family still lives in Canada. And we'd go there for a week or 2 in the summers, and she would pile us all into an old surplus pipeline Suburban and roll on down there. And I cannot imagine, like, she took us on the ferry and it's just her and 6 children all running different directions.
So at the risk of getting political very soon, how has your mom reacted to the making Canada 51st state rhetoric?
Fortunately, she hasn't been in a position to really have to deal with that. She lives now in the Anchorage Pioneer Home, and she's had progressive frontotemporal dementia that came on during COVID. And so this latest phase of kind of US-Canada relations, she has been checked out of, which is good. During the first Trump presidency, which she was lucid for, and was largely before the onset of her symptoms. She was dismayed by that and just the attitude toward our allies and former allies in NATO and other places, just that kind of macho attitude of you're either with us or you're against us, and it doesn't matter how much blood and treasure we've shared together and lost together fighting the world wars and everything else. That I think was hard for her to abide. She's somebody who is very invested in kind of the strength of all of the relationships in her life. And so I think she extended that to the way that she believed things should behave between nations, and that should count for something.
Do you still have family in Canada?
I do. Yeah. Quite
And
a
do you
bit.
talk to them?
Yeah. Yeah. And they will occasionally message me on social media and be like, what's going on now? And I will have to explain that, none of us are really, we just take all of it as it comes. And every day it's something else.
How's your dad doing?
He had a stroke in 2007. He no longer has the use of his right arm. And when he talks, it's like he's been affected by that loss of kind of muscle coordination. So you have to make an effort to understand what he's saying, but it's perfectly, like, he forms thoughts well. And he still writes a little bit. He can't exactly hold like a kind of a narrative thread long enough to make a full-length story anymore, but he's still very happy writing emails to friends and family members. Right now, he's actually down in Kansas visiting his family and friends down there.
Was your mom taking care of your dad after the stroke?
Yeah, he didn't need a lot of taking care of, but when you only got one arm, it does affect the way that you can live your life. Whenever he needed the jar opened or driving a manual car can be a challenge.
Without a right arm?
Yeah. So he's done it.
That's crazy.
I don't know that it's a good idea. He drives an automatic now.
And I guess just to close out the family stuff, how did you guys know that your mom was developing dementia, or did she know, or how did that diagnosis come about?
So far as I can tell, she never knew, which I think is a blessing. She never knew in a way that she communicated with us, at least. I think it did manifest itself in some anxiety, as it often does, because you start losing things and you're aware that you're losing things, but also not cognizant of exactly what's going on. But for us, I think the biggest thing, the way that it started, she began to be a little bit obsessed about things like we would all be hanging out at my parents' house after Thanksgiving or something, and she would become really worried that one of my sisters would leave and forget her cell phone there. And so she'd take her cell phone and keep giving it to my sister, even though she's like, I don't need this right now. We're just talking. And eventually it affected her direction finding ability. She would get lost on the way home from town, going to the dentist, stuff that she'd done a lot of times before. And that wouldn't have been as big of an issue, except when she realized she was lost, she wouldn't check in with somebody. She would just keep driving and hope that she eventually saw something she recognized. So she would go a long way in the wrong direction. And then eventually she would call one of us and she'd be 30 miles out some road, and fortunately still have cell service. So that was when we really realized something was wrong. And even at that juncture, she was like, I don't think she accepted that it was like progressive dementia, but it progressed quickly enough that it was undeniable for all of the rest of us. So
It seems like your dad would know first.
he actually didn't. It's funny. It became very clear to all of us children who I think were paying very close attention to her when she started having the direction finding issues. And we started being like, okay, without it being a big deal and upsetting her a lot, how do we keep her from driving? Because we don't want her ending up at the Canadian border and not knowing where she is or how she got there. And with him, I think that because they were together all the time, they were living together, just a part of each other's lives and had been for 40 years. I think that it was gradual enough that he just didn't notice it in the way that we did because we weren't seeing her as often. And so the changes were obvious. And once we brought it up with him and he thought about it some, he could recognize it. But at first he was like, really? And I think it was also just not fitting with his conception of how their relationship was, because she had been taking care of him at a low level for, by that point, about a dozen years since his stroke. And so I think he had always assumed that he would die first and she would take care of him until then. And all of a sudden the situation became reversed, where she was the one who was needing care to be taken of her. And that was a big mental thing to get around for him, was that he was going to have to do some caregiving.
To get back to you at University of Alaska Fairbanks, astrophysics, shifted around, landed in journalism. What was it about journalism that attracted you?
I was not planning on journalism ever being my major. I was, at the time that I started taking journalism classes, I was a computer science major, and I had discovered, because I was already working in computer science, because there was a lot of demand for it, even without having a degree yet. And so I was doing IT work and discovering that I didn't really like it, but I had been in college and spending enough money on college by that point that I was like, okay, just get the degree and work in this while I figure out what I actually want to do. But I had a video hobby. I had kind of a prosumer level video camera and had made some short movies and things. And I was interested in doing that better. And so I took, as an elective, a video storytelling class that, was a journalism, like under the journalism department. And just immediately was like, oh, okay, like this is something that I really enjoy and that I'm actually pretty good at. And it was such a contrast to both computer science and astrophysics, both of which I enjoyed in concept. And I liked the kind of the theory behind it, but in practice, in the workplace, it was not motivating in the same way. And so I took a deep breath and was like, okay, I'm changing majors again. And now I have to take a lot more classes, but it wasn't a hard choice to make because I enjoyed it so much. It didn't feel like doing more work. It felt like getting the skills to do what I really like to do better. So,
speaking for myself, coming from a family that was pretty focused on sciences, and then I majored in English literature, there was a feeling like that wasn't a real major. That wasn't a real thing that you went to college for. You could read books on your own. You need to go to college to learn hard things. And coming from astrophysics and even computer science, sort of feeling like that journalism is sort of a soft, not rigorous area of study.
I think for me, to the extent that was an attitude, it was my own, as the funny thing. Because I think I did have that attitude with that kind of, I saw myself as an intelligent person and I wanted to do hard things. And so that was a kind of like STEM style situation. But when I got to journalism and realized I really had aptitude for that, I was like, why am I struggling with this sort of self-imposed discipline about sticking to something that's difficult, which really is not difficult for everybody? That was the problem I was facing, especially in astrophysics, is that I was working very hard at it, and I'm not bad at math, but I'm also not natural. Like, I'm not a natural at it. And I was in classes full of physics majors who were naturals and just had this natural aptitude. And I was having to work 3 or 4 times as hard to get the same result as they did because they were just naturally better at it than I was. And that was why I ended up departing from that. I was like, I don't want to work super hard to be mediocre at something my whole life. And so coming to journalism, where kind of I had that leg up on, I felt like the average person who had interest in it, that was, very easy once I got there. And from a familial standpoint, it was definitely not anything that anybody looked down on, because my dad, his master's degree was in English. And my mom had studied mostly English and history.
In comparing people who are naturally good at journalism with those who have to work at it, what do you think sets them apart? What are some skills that make someone a natural journalist?
I think a passion for reading and writing, and especially reading early. I think the earlier, that you read and read broadly and a lot of different things and read things that are good and make you think deeply, I think that's just a very relevant formative skill that it's really hard to teach later if you don't develop it early. It's in its own way like musical performance, where if there aren't things that you pick up early on while your brain is very plastic, then it's hard to develop that sensibility as time goes on, and it gets harder and harder in adulthood. But the lucky thing is that there really aren't a lot of things that are not teachable about how to be a journalist. I think that a lot of it is just innate curiosity and inquisitiveness about the way that things work and wanting answers and wanting to kind of get at the truth of things.
I'm just going to make an observation that as a third-year legislator, as I am, I have given myself permission to not be an expert on everything that's happening in the legislature. And so what I find so impressive is when I see a journalist write a very well-researched story about an issue that I'm involved in and that I know about. And then the next week I see them write a very well-researched, involved story about one of those topics that I given myself permission to not engage in. And I think, wow, the journalists are doing more work on these issues, at least in that particular case than I have. It's why I'm so grateful for the journalists who are doing the homework and showing up well prepared. And especially today, I don't know, did you see the press conference, the most recent press conference that Dunleavy gave at the Capitol, where he demanded that Sean McGuire explain the Supreme Court case?
I didn't see that one. I did hear about it while it was happening, but I was in a different meeting when it was going on. I didn't catch up on the reporting later.
And I would just say that if you put a legislator in that exact same position, I'm not sure that they would have been able to explain that Supreme Court case. Even legislators who've been working really hard on education issues, and that's what the question was about. So I felt like that was a moment where I was like, oh my gosh, that is so impressive that there's a journalist who has the governor saying, what does that Supreme Court case say? And then he answers it.
I think that in its way that journalists and legislators have similar jobs in that you don't have the time to be an expert on everything, but you do have a responsibility to figure out what the truth of something is and try and deal with it and let other people know about it. And in the world of journalism, say you are dealing with something related to DOT projects not getting out the door fast enough. And so you would, do take the form of interviews where you call up people with municipal planning organizations and DOT itself and the contractors who aren't getting the work and whatever, and say, hey, what's up with all of this? And you take what you hear from all of them and synthesize it into a story that you then share with everybody. And in the legislature, that takes the form of hearings. And when you recognize that there's a problem, call together a hearing, you have people come in and testify to you and ask them questions. And it's just a very formal way of doing the same work of not being an expert on something, but trying to listen to people who are living in that world and taking what they tell you and getting to the truth behind what you can see as the truth behind it.
You graduated 2006, 2007 from UAF?
I was there through 2011.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I got it wrong.
I switched majors twice. Well, I was a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. General Mark Hamilton was departing as president of the university, and we had at the student newspaper, the Sun Star, a series of contributed columns from folks who had been UAF students as part of the ROTC program and who had gone on to serve in the Army, and they became deployed at this base that we ended up going to, Forward Operating Base Warhorse in Bakuba. And they were sending back columns, which is to the great credit of, I think, their command structure that they allowed that to happen, because I can think of a lot of reasons why they wouldn't want this kind of direct channel of information coming back to people about what the war was like from the perspective of somebody who was in it. And anyway, General Hamilton, who was in charge of the university at that time, loved that because he was, former Army general himself, and was like, what if we did that for real? What if we sent some journalism students and a professor over there? And he had this small by university government standards pot of money and basically set it aside to send 3 of us and a professor over there. And we spent a month at Forward Operating Base Warhorse and around Diyala province in Iraq. And it was, a tremendously eye-opening opportunity. Brian O'Donoghue, who was one of my professors at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in journalism, I was on an embed in Iraq with Brian. He was the professor who accompanied us there. And so we were doing some reporting for a month, August 2009. It was mind-expanding in a lot of ways. It's a crazy thing to be like what kind of the U.S. military machine looks like when it is deployed in a foreign country as part of a campaign. It's otherworldly, the resources that exist and are being expended there. I think when you look at the pie charts that have the percentage of our budget that is devoted to national defense, you're just like, how can they possibly spend that much money? And then when you are there and you're looking at a bank of Connex boxes that are generators, and there's 15 of them in a row running 24/7 to manage the air conditioning on one base in the middle of the desert in Iraq,
You see the need for that money.
Yeah, actually, like, it's totally conceivable how this money is spent, and just the entire ecosystem that exists as part of that. And yeah, it was fascinating. And to experience the Iraqi justice system and kind of the way that their police and army are managed, and the way that local folks behave in the presence of what is essentially a colonial power was really interesting.
So you took that first job with the TV station in Fairbanks in 2011.
Yeah, I started in August of 2011 at the local CBS affiliate in Fairbanks, KXDF.
And what kinds of stories were you doing? What were you doing, actually?
There were 3 of us reporters at the time at the station, and we divided all stories up roughly by beats, but there was enough to cover, and few of us enough that we were doing all kinds of different things. But generally, my beats were politics and government, and then courts. So the somewhat harder, more policy-related stories. And it was largely out of interest. We had another reporter who was much more into kind of like business stories, and another one who was more into feature-y stuff. And so like it was an easy division, which I think is fortunate, because in larger markets than Fairbanks, there's a lot of kind of sharp elbowedness about being on each other's turf and poaching stories from somebody who sees themselves as the only person who can do the feature reporting or the politics reporting. But it was everybody pitching in.
And it sounded like you made some movies earlier, so it seemed like broadcast journalism was the direction you were going to go. How long did you stay there, and what led you into print journalism?
I was there for 3 years, and I think that what led me toward print was that over time, even though I had started because of my interest in video as the medium, I recognized that I was chafing at how limited the amount of time and word count you could get for a TV news story. A lot of times you'd have 30 seconds worth of time for something that wasn't a particularly in-depth story, whereas the same story, if you were writing for a newspaper, you'd get 500 words, which is a lot more. And I wanted to have a way to tell the bigger story, or at least the story in more depth. So that was one thing. And I also recognized after a while that it was my writing that was like better than my shooting and editing of the video. And it was ultimately what I liked more about the job. I would focus more on the writing, and I think that my shot selection and time to edit ended up suffering because of that, because it's all trade-offs in TV. It's probably the most demanding time-wise of the mediums if you're doing it all yourself, which is the way that most TV journalists, even in larger markets, do it now. It's only the kind of the pretty large markets where you have the luxury of having somebody who assembles the video for you while you just do the reporting part of it and write the script. So after 3 years, there was an opening at the Fairbanks Daily News-Miner to be their opinion editor, and I applied for it and ultimately got it and started writing daily editorials for them, as well as taking in the letters to the editor and guest opinion pieces from folks in the community.
Explain the importance of opinions and editorials compared to objective journalism. It is a transition. It's a different approach. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. I think that just having opinion journalism doesn't make much sense without the kind of the straight news reporting to back it up. So if I were running a newspaper, for instance, I would cut the opinion section before I cut the straight news reporting. But I think in a healthy newspaper or journalistic enterprise, you really want to have both, because you want to have your news reporters telling the story of how things are, and you want there to be opinion space where people can talk about things as they should be. And I think that's the big distinction, is that you want people to be able to take what they read in the news or watch in the news or listen to in the news and kind of react to that and say, okay, here's this problem that we know exists and people have been talking about, and this is what I feel like we should do about it, or this is why I feel like the direction we're going on this issue is wrong, or this is a big new plan that I have to deal with a problem that nobody has adequately dealt with.
Can you talk about the political landscape and the interior and what you felt like the opinion section should reflect?
Yeah, I think all good opinion sections, departments, whatever, reflect their community and they reflect the audience of whatever the publication is. And I think that in that way, letters to the editor are the heart of the enterprise, because that's everybody. It's like the original social media in a way that is a little bit more curated and less toxic than what we know social media to be these days. Just a big equalizer in the sense that anybody can weigh in on any issue, and it's the level of editing, if you're doing it well, is pretty light. So people's voice comes through, and it's like you are in a town hall meeting with your whole town, and everybody's getting to have their say, and everybody gets the same amount of time to address things. And so it should be reflective of the community. And Anchorage and Fairbanks, I think, share a kind of a pretty broad spectrum of people's political positions and opinions. And that makes, fortunately, for a really good, healthy debate in the opinion space. I think that opinion sections are less healthy when people actually all are more or less on the same page about things. There's small towns I've been to where there's just an orthodoxy. And when everybody thinks that there's one solution to something, you don't get the breadth of perspective that leads people to question what that orthodoxy is.
Was the Fairbanks Daily News-Miner allowing comments on letters to the editor and editorials?
Yeah, we were. And we used, at the time, a comment platform that was based on Facebook. And so people would comment based with their Facebook pages. And the intent was that they would have that tied to their identity. And so they would be less apt to be vitriolic and mean to each other and whatever. And of course, it did not work out that way in practice. And sometimes that was because people would set up fake Facebook pages where it was obviously not their actual identity, and they would just flame everybody. And then other times, people would be under their own identity and yet be perfectly happy to attack their friends and neighbors in a way that they obviously would not do in real life, thank God.
And I want to get to your decision to move to the ADN, but since we're talking about this, the ADN's decision not to go from having a lot of comments to not allowing comments, were you part of that decision-making process?
I was, and I wasn't the person who made the decision to flip the switch, but when it happened, I did support it. And it is, I think, unfortunate to not have a venue where comments can be a productive space, because I think, like I said about letters to the editor, when you have that kind of breadth of community discussion, if folks can be respectful, then it can be really productive. It can lead to people having their assumptions challenged, and whether or not they have their minds changed in that instance, it can make them think differently about issues. And I think that there's a lot of value in comments in that way. And we explored a lot of different ways to try and keep that space positive and to keep it civil. And ultimately, we just weren't able to do it. And I'd love to say that it was because of Russian bot networks or something. But the reality is that it just devolved into small communities of people who live and work in Alaska who were just perfectly happy to make that a toxic space and to say things that were bigoted or not based in reality, and that's dismaying, because I think that we really wanted to have that be a town square for people, and ultimately we weren't. It took too much time and resources to curate that and keep the hate out of it.
So one place where comments are obviously still allowed is on social media. Person that I look to that is an inspiration for me is Lisa Murkowski, like her team and herself doing social media posts where there are hundreds of comments that are just disgusting. But she doesn't stop doing the social media posts and she hasn't turned off her comments. So I try to look to that inspiration. I will say that I was hosting a town hall last weekend and we were promoting it on social media at the time that the former Speaker of the House in Minnesota was killed. And so then the comments on my town hall were screenshots of the assassination in Minnesota. And obviously I got law enforcement involved because I did take it as a threat. And we did have law enforcement at the town hall. I posted pictures of the town hall and the posts were that the APD can't protect you. So I've done additional reports. But the point is that I'm trying to make there is that if we didn't allow comments, I wouldn't see that. And so in a way, I feel like knowing that there are people out there is almost helpful. Law enforcement knew exactly who the person was. Like, even though it was a fake account, they knew who the person was. Unfortunately, that person has actually killed someone before, so they take the threat seriously. But anyway, I'm just putting that in there just as there's part of me that as much as I appreciate wanting to keep some of the especially violent vitriol out, that there is a silver lining to being able to see it.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a similar debate to a lot of debates that there are about whether, say, it's a good thing that people are expressing racist ideology in public, in that, like, then at least you know who those people are. But I think that it's a double-edged sword when people are able to make comments like that in some kind of a public forum, whether it's online or in person or whatever. There's an emboldening that happens of people who might think the same thing, but recognize that it's not a good idea to say it. And I guess the real question is it more effective at stamping out that ideology? Is it more effective to have that be something that can take place in public? Or is it so that people can know and see who's participating in it? Or does that kind of help that spread?
And also, I just finished reading Sarah Wynne Williams' book, Careless People. She was an executive at Facebook, and she just published an expose. And in her book, she talks about Facebook really being about the clicks and the amount of money that they can generate, which meant that they would have this speech about, we're looking to tamp down on hate speech. We have standards people must follow. But in reality, not tamping anything down, because the more extreme comments were generating more viewership, were generating more clicks, which was their primary goal. And I wonder if stopping the comments on ADN led to a decrease in readership of the opinion section.
I'm sure that the people who were avid commenters would hold that was the case. And I think that broadly there have been readership declines since the time that we shut off comments, but that also has been just an industry-wide trend, that there was a big spike in news readership, viewership, listenership at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, because everybody was looking for information that might keep them alive. And then eventually that tailed off. And we shut down comments fairly early on. I think it was that first COVID summer. And a big part of it, too, was that people were using the comment space to spread misinformation about the disease and potential cures. And that was something I was dealing with in letters, too, which was a situation I had never encountered before, where I tried to give people a lot of latitude in what they could say. But when all of a sudden you are talking about information and misinformation that could be a life and death situation for people, the math is different. And we might not publish things like...
And it was so politicized. I think this is a place where the far left and the far right can meet, like the sort of COVID skeptics They were definitely on both sides of the political spectrum. But from my perspective, living in Anchorage, it was Save Anchorage, which was a grassroots organization like similar to Save America, which was like a nationwide, quote unquote, grassroots organization that was opposing mask mandates, was supportive of using alternative treatments for COVID that were not backed up by medical science. And so I wonder if there was this pressure, if we don't publish this letter supporting ivermectin, if we're going to look like a liberal publication, because we're not publishing the conservative perspective.
Yeah. And the way that we looked at it was that although the folks who were ivermectin proponents in specific were largely conservative, believing that ivermectin is a cure for anything except for worms in your horses is not a conservative point of view. It's just one that people tend to latch onto. And I think that when it comes to stuff like that, fortunately, that in its way is an easy call, because you look at what, the science says, and it says that like this is something that is not helpful for controlling COVID, and in fact is not healthy for you to ingest. And if people are making claims about it being some kind of a wonder drug, that's a fairly easy factual call to make and just be like, okay, you're making claims that are not supported by the facts, and so we can't publish your letter. And so that.
And would you respond then and tell them that?
Yeah, when people would send in things, at least when they were actually people from here in Alaska, because we also got a lot of kind of blanket messages sent from people throughout the country who were sending them to every publication. And that happens on all kinds of issues. But of course, it also happened on COVID.
I have to just say, as a healthcare provider, I have prescribed ivermectin to people. So if you have scabies that doesn't respond to the typical treatment, or if you have someone who is unhoused or living in a dry cabin, doesn't have access to a shower in a certain way, you would sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes use ivermectin as a treatment for scabies, since the way we normally treat it is by putting a lotion all over your body, having you sleep with it on, and then rinse it off the next day. If that's not practical, you could do ivermectin to kill the scabies. So that was my only experience as a healthcare provider using ivermectin in an emergency department was in that case.
I had no idea. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. It can't be prescribed to people. But so there's a legislator that I work with who's quite adamant, even in 2025, that television is still extraordinarily important, and that it's more important than print journalism. And that if we want to get our message out, we need to make sure that we're still being covered on TV. I am younger than this legislator, and I feel from my perspective that that's not really true. Lots of people have Hulu instead. Like, we don't have the same number of people watching local broadcast television as we used to. Having said that, we don't have that many people reading traditional print journalism anymore. So maybe we're both right.
Yeah, I think it's true that there isn't this kind of, there's not a way to reach everybody these days. The audience has self-fractured into a lot of different channels, chasing whatever their preferred delivery mechanism is, and also in a lot of cases chasing after sources that confirm a lot of their existing biases, which is unfortunate, but it's the way that the world works. But yeah, I think that the TV market is important demographically because people who watch TV news often don't consume a lot of other news. Everybody is familiar with the extent to which Fox News has captured the zeitgeist on the right, where that's what propelled Donald Trump's candidacy probably both times around. The second time around, I feel like there were other alternative TV and video journalism sources that were aiding in that effort more so than back in 2016. But it has a lot of power among a certain demographic. That demographic happens to typically be older. It happens to be skeptical of other media. And I think it probably, like, TV audiences tend to generally skew a little more conservative than the electorate as a whole. And I think that radio journalism, and to maybe a lesser extent print journalism, tends to skew slightly probably to the left of the electorate as a whole. But it's
I
not.
would say like NPR might, in terms of who's listening, but talk radio in Alaska is still dominated by the conservatives.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's true nationwide too, that talk radio, and that's been the case for decades, has been the domain, not exclusively, because you've got things like Democracy Now!, but it has been the space that was created and dominated by Rush Limbaugh, and this kind of legacy continues in all kinds of different.
I listened to the interview put out by the New York Times. It was an interview from last week with Andrew Schultz, who has his own podcast that tends to trend very conservative, but he talked about, in the last election cycle, wanting to really have voices from all sides, and the left absolutely turning down his interview requests. And so they ended up featuring the right. But he's like, but we didn't want to do that. It's just the left refused to show up. And then he said, and the part that bothered him the most was that they lied about it. And he said the Harris team said that they hadn't been invited when we most certainly had. He's like, we had Mark Cuban on, who was a surrogate for their team. He had been on the podcast afterwards. We'd said with him, hey, we want Waltz to come on. We want Harris to come on. Mark Cuban had said he was going to work on that. And I wonder, and it may not be something that you feel comfortable talking about, the left ceding the space to the conservatives and not being present in certain media landscapes at all and choosing not to be present.
It all feeds itself. And I think it's just a kind of a specific symptom of this tendency that we've had since the advent of social media to self-segregate in opinion spaces into ones that feed our individual biases and where we feel supported. And part of that is just people feeling like they don't have the time or the effort to seek out sources that don't conform with what they already believe and try to parse out what's right, and just leave that job up to people who they trust, who happen to share their own biases. And it happens at all levels. And the part of it that you're talking about here, where the actual people at the highest levels politically are choosing to not engage in the spaces with what could be seen as the opposition, is that they see that there's more profit in kind of basically speaking to only friendly sources, because those are the people who are going to say vote for them are not going to be listening to or watching. Say if you're the Harris team, those folks are not going to be watching Fox News. They're not going to be watching One America News Network. They're not going to be listening to the Joe Rogan podcast. So I think that it is both a rational and an emotional response, but it's one that has been very destructive in our politics because that center has been lost and people have self-divided into their own camps, and we're not talking to each other in the same way, or at least most of us aren't. There are still the Lisa Murkowskis out there who are engaging both audiences, but you can see that it's a hard thing to do because by times she pisses off both sides of that space, and by times both sides want her out. I think it's harder than people understand to live that kind of balance that people say they want, but don't actually participate in themselves as often, where you say you want politicians who will listen to all sides of an argument and who will engage everybody and not just the people who voted for them. But in practice, they find more political success many times. Like, how many times do you see Donald Trump engaging with people who are hostile
on the left? He walked out of the
agenda?
Leslie Stahl interview. Like he's done, which interestingly, I listened, Leslie Stahl was on the New Yorker Radio Hour interview with their editor, David Remnick. And what was so interesting about that interview and her talking about Trump walking out is that she said, look, he stopped answering questions, but we still needed to film like the B-roll of like them walking and talking. And so she said, so he did this scene during the interview of like, we're done here. And he's like, do you want to film the B-roll now? And so in part, she said that she felt like that the interview was fine. She said, well, the way that it wasn't him storming off the set, they filmed the B-roll. So I guess what that tells me is that it's performative. They're creating a certain narrative. He's saying the crooked media, the lamestream media, using those sorts of terms specifically about CBS and 60 Minutes. But yet when he does the interview, he's cooperative after he's done his little scene.
I think that's absolutely a thing. And it always has been the case that politics is a sort of a performance art. And there are some things you do because they're exactly how you are thinking and feeling in that moment. And there are things that you do because they are what you feel like people maybe expect of you or are going to motivate people to act in the way that you want them to, whether that's voting for you, standing up on a particular issue, et cetera. And sometimes I feel like sometimes that impulse is noble and sometimes it's self-serving in the way that there are definitely a lot of speeches that are given on the House floor in the legislature and in any political body that are strictly red meat for base voters so that you can point to this thing and be like, look, here's this clip about me talking about how I'm never going to back down on your Second Amendment rights or whatever.
I'll go there. I want to, not about Second Amendment rights, but when we were debating whether or not to give Suzanne Downing from Must Read Alaska a legislative citation sponsored by Representative Jamie Allard from Eagle River, legislator for Big Lake, he did this publicly on the record, gave this speech where he said that the ADN will not publish my editorials, but Must Read Alaska will. And I remember sitting in my chair saying, I just don't think that's true. I think the ADN would absolutely publish your editorial. I'm guessing that you don't submit them to the ADN because that's not your audience.
Generally, that's the case. Is that Kevin McCabe?
Kevin McCabe.
Okay, just making sure. I think you can look, and I remember running at least one from him when he submitted them. But I think that is largely the case. And in some cases, maybe they've submitted one in the past that hasn't run for whatever reason, whether there were issues of fact with it or whether there were questions that needed to be answered and communication somehow it became no longer topical as an issue or something and the ball got dropped. But so it's not like I wouldn't accuse people of necessarily making that up, but a lot of times I think the perception is that just they won't run, like because of what I have to say, they won't run it. And in practice, when I was the opinion editor for the ADN, I was often a little bit saddened that there wasn't more engagement from the conservative side because of just the perception of the ADN as a source that catered to or was favorable to liberal Alaskans. And in fact, it was like, you can tell when you read the letters to the editor, it is largely folks on the left who are writing in and say, complaining about votes that Senator Sullivan or Representative Begich are making in Washington. And yeah, like the ratio is definitely in favor of the left. And it's not because a lot of letters from conservative writers are getting spiked. It's because
they're not there.
They're not writing them.
So when the Binkley family took over the paper, John Binkley is a conservative. He beat Frank Murkowski in the primary for governor's race when Sarah Palin won that primary. It was Sarah Palin first place, John Binkley second place, Frank Murkowski, incumbent governor, third place in that Republican primary. I feel like the fear in the more progressive circles when the Binkleys took over was that the paper was going to take a sharp right turn. I guess you were there when that happened. What was the experience like on the inside?
I came on board in April of 2018. So they had bought the paper out of bankruptcy the previous fall. And so the dust had settled by then. There were a lot of layoffs in that bankruptcy because immediately prior to the bankruptcy, the ADN was losing a lot of money under Alice Rogoff's stewardship. And so they needed to find a way to balance the books. And a lot of good people lost their jobs. But I think that even the folks who got laid off there were on the same page that the existence of the enterprise was more important than anybody's job, which is, I think, a really benevolent way to view your own layoff. And yeah, I have a lot of respect for the folks who didn't stay on with the paper then and I'm in touch with a lot of them, and most of them actually have gone on to, I don't know if necessarily bigger and better things. I think in a lot of cases, bigger and better things, but things that they enjoyed and have found life after the ADN. Anyway, so I came in the immediate aftermath of that, and I had actually previously worked for the Binkleys for several years, summers at their riverboat business in Fairbanks, just a kind of a tourism job. And I, after several years working that job, which I enjoyed and got to know the family pretty well, I was like, oh, I have no aspirations to make a career out of tourism. This was while I was in college. And so I was like, well, so I don't really ever see myself working for the Binkleys again. And then, of course, they bought the newspaper. But so it was funny to be working for them again. But of course, I was on the paper's editorial board, which when I started there, the members of that editorial board were Brian Binkley, who represented ownership, Andy Pennington, who was the publisher, myself, Andrew Jensen, who at that time was the editor of the Alaska Journal of Commerce, and then later worked in the governor's press shop and is now a policy advisor for Governor Tom Levy. And then Julia O'Malley was the other member of the editorial board, and she left fairly early on. It wasn't a great fit for her. I don't think she liked the tenor of the discussions. It wasn't a space where she felt comfortable, which I understood. But that said, it was never a situation, and this continued even as the makeup of the editorial board changed. By the end, it was just myself, Ryan, and our publisher, Andy Pennington. But it was never a situation where outside of the editorial, which, effectively does reflect the views of ownership. And I think although different outlets have editorial boards with different makeup, et cetera, largely that's the case at newspapers around the country, is that although there are other people who are involved in that decision-making process and it doesn't solely reflect ownership's opinion, you're going to find that it's at least not typically stuff that ownership disagrees with. So that editorial was the space in which ownership expressed its opinion effectively and like in concert with other members of the editorial board. And outside of that, even on the opinion page, in the opinion space, there was very little participation by ownership. There was no pressure from ownership to report on things or report on things that were already being reported on differently. I think that everybody was really gratified by that, because when you have people come into the news business who don't have a long background with it and don't necessarily understand how all of the systems work, there can be an expectation that they're going to want to have their own way, and that they're going to have a lot of sway in the kind of the day-to-day operations. And fortunately, that has not been the case with the Binkley family and their ownership of the ADN. Their participation in stuff that goes into the paper is restricted to the editorials, and by the editorials, the ones that are the house editorials, not anybody's guest opinions. And I think that's the appropriate place for it, and I was gratified by it. I think that there was a lot of speculation as to what they wanted, like what their goal was when they bought it. And the explanation that Ryan gave a lot of us at the time, and it's not like there's one reason why you do a thing, but I believe what he said about the reasons why their family invested in the ADN, which was that they are a family with a long history in Alaska, and they believe that great cities, great states need good sources, great newspapers, great TV stations, great radio stations, and they didn't want to have the kind of paper of record for Alaska either go to some hedge fund in the lower 48 or cease to exist altogether. If you're invested in a place, you want its systems to be healthy, and journalism is one of those systems.
So I'm just meeting you face to face for the first time. We've interacted over the years because I would do a letter to the editor. I wouldn't see it for a few days. I would send you like a Twitter message and say like, hey, did you get is it going to print? Are you going to do it? And that was really the extent of my interaction with you until last year, when I was serving as a minority member on the House Judiciary Committee. There were 3 anti-trans bills that were suddenly thrust upon the Judiciary Committee with this mandate that we were going to move all 3 bills quickly through and move them onto the House floor. And I felt shut down in committee, not allowed to ask questions, not allowed to push back at all in the vetting process of these bills. So I lost my mind. I went a little crazy in terms of they're not going to do that. I released a podcast episode every single day. I interviewed parents of trans kids. I interviewed trans kids. I interviewed their doctors and released this series of 8 podcasts, 8 days in a row. And then I was like, now I'm going to do an op-ed and I'm going to incorporate all that I've learned. And it was a very large piece. And I'm really grateful because you guys published an abbreviated version in the paper, but you published, I believe, all of it in the online edition. And I'm curious about if there was any resistance to do that.
No, there was no, I didn't ask. Because that's not the way that it worked. You know, like I didn't run stuff by Ryan Bingley. I mean, I do remember asking just kind of format questions to our editor, David Hewlin, when that happened, just about the best way to make it. Because basically, this is a little bit inside baseball, but if you look online, for instance, our guidance on op-ed guest opinion commentaries is that we ask that they be between 500 and 600 words, which is pretty short. And if you were to call me and say, hey, I've got this thing, it's longer than 500 words, whatever, I would cop to the reality, which is that like anywhere from 500 to 800 words is totally fine. Generally, the 500 to 600 word guidance exists because otherwise we would have people submitting 2,000 word screeds all the time and expecting us to publish them. And it's just an unmanageable amount of editing that has to happen. And
but
also,
for the record, I was over 2,000 words.
It's also, in most cases, we've got tracking on the website that tells us how deep into stories people will read.
People aren't reading more than a few paragraphs.
No, by the end of a 800-word story, news story, or opinion piece, you're lucky if a third of the people who started it have read all the way to the end. That would be a very good percentage. So the further you go, if it's 1,000 words, if it's 2,000 words, you've got 10% of the people who started. You're very lucky. So anyway, I do remember checking in that specific case about what it made sense to publish, like how long it made sense to publish in print versus online. You have all the space in the world. So if somebody's going to follow a link there, there's really nothing that you lose in a sense by giving somebody the space that they feel like they need to make whatever argument they need to. So that is the kind of the beauty of online, is that you're not dealing with the constraints of a printed page, where if a piece is longer than, say, 1,000 words, it's difficult to format the page well in print the way that pieces end up.
And now that you've left journalism for the moment, can you just talk about the media environment in Alaska as you see it? And I have a question specifically about whether we pay our journalists enough to justify them doing the work as a journalist, as opposed to leaving to go work other jobs. Emily Goody-Coons has done this. You've done this. Sean McGuire just left. I don't know where he's headed, but it seems like we see a lot of people leaving the ADN. And I assume that part of it is probably monetary. I'm just guessing that they're probably going to make more money at their job outside of journalism than they were making at their job in journalism.
The answer to the question very succinctly is no, journalists are not paid enough. It doesn't matter what medium it is. It doesn't matter what outlet it is. Journalists are not paid enough. You would probably count the journalists in the country on very few hands who I feel like are adequately compensated for the work that they do. And those tend to be the ones who are at the top of the pyramid, whose names everybody recognizes because they're the kind of the rock star reporters for NPR and for the New York Times and for Fox,
60 Minutes,
Fox News, MSNBC, you know, like the names, people who have shows that have their names in them. And the shame of it is that 99% of the work of journalism is being done by people whose names you never recognize unless you live in their towns and pay very close attention to bylines. And this is by its nature a young workforce, because they're people who maybe haven't started families yet and don't have the kind of cost pressures that that people do who find themselves getting out of journalism.
We haven't talked about that. Are you married?
I am not married, and actually that's part of my story of leaving journalism, or at least, yeah, for now. But I was married, and I left the ADN at a time when my partner and I were getting divorced, and that was definitely a part of the financial calculus for me, was that maintaining a household on two incomes, and one of which was a journalist's income, that was totally workable. It wasn't like comfortable, but it was doable. And when I was confronting the reality of doing that on one salary, my own salary, the math got a lot harder, especially living in Anchorage, where rent or mortgage payments or whatever, it's tougher here than a lot of other places. And it was just, I could have made it work, but I would have been basically treading water. And that would have been lucky on my part. There's a lot of journalism folks who can only make it work because they don't have families, they don't have kids to provide for. They have, in a lot of cases, a partner who has a steadier and more robust income. And when those things are no longer the case, you'll see when people start families, they get out of journalism. When people have changes in their life circumstances, if they have health challenges or something, oftentimes you'll see folks leaving journalism as they just enter a phase in their lives where they start to think about the fact that eventually they are going to need retirement savings. You'll see people
start thinking about, how am I going to support myself when I'm 60?
Exactly. And it's why you don't see people staying at outlets for 20, 30, 40 years in the same way as you did before. And it's because people can't sustain themselves for an entire career on what you make as a journalist, because you're not, generally speaking, getting regular raises.
And it's not an 8-to-5 job. You're potentially getting calls after hours on the weekends. I'm guessing that it's pretty all-consuming if you're doing your job right.
Yeah, it's difficult to not have it consume a lot of your time, mental energy outside of hours that you're getting paid for. And I will say that journalism outlets, and the ADN in particular, are good, or at least in my experience, about making sure you're not working a lot of hours you're not getting paid for. So it's not like they're violating labor laws, but it just, as a nature of the medium, is if you care about it a lot, and people don't get into it who don't care about it a lot, because you're not getting into it for fame and fortune, that's for sure. There's a lot of kind of uncompensated labor that's happening just in terms of getting up to speed on issues and things like that you can't necessarily afford when you've got kids that you're dealing with, or if you don't have another person to help balance the load.
So when you took the job in Grier Hopkins administration, it sounds like a large part of the decision was financial, but I'm curious about any hesitation about becoming no longer objective and aligning yourself with a more progressive boss, that it would be difficult to go back to journalism and not have Must Read Alaska write stories about liberal Tom Hewitt comes back to push his agenda.
Yeah, that was something I weighed a lot. And you're right, like there was a big financial piece of that was part of that math. And I definitely talked to people in the journalism space who have moved one direction or the other. I think you probably know Larry Pursley,
yes,
who is the owner and publisher of the Wrangell Sentinel, and who has done policy work for Lisa Murkowski and other...
Barry Patola.
In other capacities. And it's not like he's like a beat reporter or anything, but he certainly has a presence in the world of journalism. And he was a person who I talked to say, hey, Larry, say I take this job. A lot of my heart is still in journalism. To what extent is it realistic for me to think, what kind of things could I do in journalism if I at some point want to return to this? And he had good advice and talked about how it is a little bit different when somebody who already is in the opinion space moves into basically a policy role, kind of deals with that same space, like implementing policies that in previous iterations of the career, you were just participating in the discussion of that policy. And that's a kind of a somewhat more fluid thing than I think it would be difficult to, say, make the kind of move that I made, where you are going from working for a newspaper to municipal government. I think going back to being, say, a politics beat reporter, there definitely would be, say, people in the Capitol who would be like, I'm not talking to you because I know what your political stripes are and you're just going to paint me as the bad guy. And I think that's reasonable on their part, honestly. Whatever a person's actual political beliefs are, regardless of the job that they have, if you do enter the political space working for a particular administration, it's reasonable for people to have a reaction to that based on the politics of the person leading that administration. And that's what a lot of folks who were in the first Trump administration were upset about after the fact, is that they found that there were a lot of people for whom they felt like the doors had closed to them because they had worked in the Trump administration, or people who didn't want to hire people who had worked for Donald Trump. And there's both sides of that you can understand, where like they feel like they're doing policy work, it might not have reflected their own views, etc. And the other side of that is the people who were in a position to hire them and choosing not to, who were like, you were perfectly happy carrying water for this administration who was implementing policies that we find anathema to our own beliefs, so why would we hire you?
And I think when you look at like the national media landscape, Jen Psaki went from the Obama and the Biden administration to MSNBC. Lawrence O'Donnell worked in the U.S. Senate. I guess there's lots of examples of people who worked in political administrations and then went into journalism. But we obviously don't have our version of MSNBC in Alaska. So there's not the same sort of exit strategy from politics back into journalism.
Yeah, and Alaska is also just not a community that is big enough to support things like that, where you like, even on the conservative side of the aisle, where there is a propensity with outlets like Must Read Alaska, where there's definitely an appetite for conservative news reporting and opinion content. It's not like people can make a living providing opinion content to Must Read Alaska or similar outlets.
What do you do in the Grier Hopkins administration?
I'm special assistant to the mayor. So broadly, I work on issues related to economic development, the military presence in the Fairbanks North Star Borough, and a lot of kind of just different policy stuff, transportation. We just got a baseball field on the National Historic Register. It's a lot of things all over the place. It's a lot of stuff broadly focused on economic development, plus a lot of other duties as assigned. There's a lot of times when I go to meetings that the mayor would like to be at and learn what's going on there, but doesn't. It's cross.
Sort of like a surrogate.
Yeah, exactly. And I obviously don't have the powers that the mayor has, but I'm there to represent the mayor. If there's things that I feel like the mayor needs to know about whatever's going on, or if there's communications that we need to relay, then I do that.
If you had a magic wand and you could change the media landscape in Alaska, what would be the biggest change you'd want to see?
I would want there to be a path to sustainability for the state's outlets, all of them. I feel like, comparatively speaking, the ADN is the healthiest of the media outlets in Alaska, and they are broadly supported enough that if all of the ad dollars dried up tomorrow and they were just making it go on subscriptions, they wouldn't have to lay off 3/4 of the newsroom. There would be a reporting presence that would still be able to adequately cover a lot of the issues. But I don't think that can be said essentially of any other outlet in the state, and even ones that we have, I think, taken for granted prior, like Alaska Public Media. With the pending rescission of federal funding, we've seen just how fragile that can be, and that none of that can be taken for granted. And I obviously haven't looked at the books of all of them, but basically for every newspaper that's not the ADN in the state, if all revenue other than subscriber revenue dried up tomorrow, I don't know how many of them would be able to remain in business at all, how many would be able to support a meaningful reporting presence. It's not like there would be no income whatsoever, but they would be, at best, just a bare shadow of their former selves. None of them would be able to continue to have a print product. They would all become blogs, basically.
Do you have any advice for listeners who might be concerned about the drying up of the media landscape in Alaska?
please subscribe to and donate to as much media as you can, and know that there are going to be times when you're going to be disappointed by the quality or the tone of the journalism. And it's because it often is being done by folks who have not been here their whole lives and who have not had long reporting careers, because that's not what the outlets can afford to pay for. I can understand when that's frustrating. And like when, say, if you are a subscriber, you will read an article or listen to a story where you're like, why is this something that I am paying to support? But I don't think people understand like how much would be lost if that went away altogether, because just being on the other side of things in Fairbanks, I participate in meetings and hearings, and I'll be there and there's no reporter present. And I'm like, oh my God, if people knew what was happening. And it's just recognizing that this is something that the community is going to care about.
And if there's no reporter there, if the public doesn't know that something's happening, it's kind of like a tree falling in the forest that no one, did it really fall. It keeps people honest. It keeps people concerned about what the public will think about something. I just don't think it could be overstated that the media is essential to a functioning government.
Yeah, it was Thomas Jefferson who said, and I'm going to get this quote a little bit wrong, but if I could choose between a government with no reporting and reporting with no government, I would not hesitate for a moment in choosing the latter, because he saw the kind of the free press as that important to the functioning of society, that he saw them as in a lot of ways being more important than the government itself in maintaining honesty in public discourse. And it is crucial because that is what keeps us from just retreating to all of our different sources of quote unquote truth that we're inclined to believe in the absence of somebody who is doing that curation for us.
Last question. Do you have a book that you would recommend to listeners?
Sure. One that I've actually been reading recently is The Fairbanks Four by Brian O'Donoghue, who was one of my professors at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in journalism, and a long time ago rented a dry cabin from my parents. Anyway, it's about the trial and incarceration and eventual release and kind of vindication of 4 Fairbanks native teenagers who were arrested and convicted of the murder of John Hartman, who was a young man who was actually in my class at Lathrop High School, and just goes through what happens to a community when there's something like that happens that has a lot of racial overtones and really divides a community in a lot of ways. It's very well done, and it's a lot broader than just the specific case.
Hey, Tom Hewitt, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Hey, happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@ahaleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.